John Hastings, a man of medium height and a determined gaze, stepped into the tavern looking for something he couldn't quite name. It was an ordinary night, with waves crashing violently against the docks, and a chill wind that seemed to cut to the bone. He approached the bar, ordered a mug of rum, and took in the scene around him. Shadows had murmured secrets and tales that few would believe to be real. In a dimly lit corner, John spotted an old sailor. The man was tall, with a scruffy beard and eyes that had seen too many storms. He waved John over, inviting him to sit. Without hesitation, John picked up his drink and made his way over. As soon as he sat down, the old man began to spin a tale that, to John, sounded more like a fisherman's yarn than reality. He spoke of an island no one had ever found, a place full of ancient secrets and unimaginable riches. As the old man spoke, he pulled out a map. It was ancient, with tattered edges and marks of age. John examined the document closely. The winding lines and exotic symbols caught his attention. The sailor insisted that the map showed the way to the legendary Isle of Eternity, a place from which no one had ever returned. Kings and explorers were said to have tried, only to vanish without a trace. The story seemed absurd, but there was a glimmer of truth in the old man's eyes that ignited John's curiosity. Captain Hastings, as he liked to be called, was not a man to shy away from a challenge. He accepted the map without question, paid the old man a handful of coins, and left the tavern with his mind buzzing with possibilities. As he walked back to the ship, he studied the map intently. There was a specific route marked with unknown symbols and warnings written in a lost language. John knew his men would hesitate, but he was determined to follow what felt like a calling. The next morning, Hastings gathered his crew and presented the map. Some men laughed, others grew serious, but all of them knew there was no arguing with the captain's resolve. They set sail the next day, as the first rays of sunlight lit up the sea. John felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but there was an unusual energy driving him, a sense that he was on the verge of uncovering something far greater than himself. The ship, aptly named the Voyager, cut through the waves with an uncommon speed, as if the ocean itself were conspiring in their favor. For the first few days, the weather was favorable, and the crew was lively. But John had a feeling that something was about to happen. The map intrigued him. He spent hours locked away in his cabin, poring over every line, every mark, trying to decipher what the old man had left unsaid. It didn't take long for him to notice symbols that resembled strange creatures and storms, as if the path ahead was fraught with dangers that only a keen eye could foresee. Then, on the fourth day of their voyage, the weather began to change. The sky darkened, and the wind carried the scent of a storm. The crew began to grow restless, and John could sense their unease. He knew this would not be an ordinary journey. The captain remained firm, trying to calm the crew, but inside, he too was battling a rising fear. At that moment, he realized there was more to the map than just a direction. It was an invitation to a challenge that few would dare accept. John could taste the salt in the air and hear the distant rumble of thunder. He gripped the wheel tightly, determined to press on. No matter what lay ahead, he was willing to pay the price. After all, he was John Hastings, the captain who ventured into unknown seas in search of glory and adventure. With one last look at the map, he murmured to himself that he was ready. Little did he know, he was about to encounter mysteries that would test not only his courage but also his very grasp of reality. The sea felt different on the fifth day. Aboard the Voyager, John watched the horizon as the wind whipped through the sails and the crew kept their eyes on the turbulent waters. The sun had risen pale, shrouded by heavy clouds, foreshadowing what was to come. On deck, anxious whispers spread among the men, and John knew that tension was mounting with each passing moment. They had all heard the stories, but now, with the sky closing in above them, the legends seemed to come alive. John was torn between excitement and fear. The storm advanced quickly, and the waters grew increasingly treacherous. He had faced storms before, but there was something strange about the way the waves moved, as if they were orchestrated to challenge them. The crew's shouts echoed as they tried to hold control, but every time one problem was resolved, another arose, and the danger seemed inevitable. When the first flash of lightning lit up the sky, John gripped the wheel tightly, ordering the crew to prepare. The sails were furled, and the men braced themselves, ready to face the fury of the sea. Thunder roared, and monstrous waves tossed the ship from side to side. John shouted orders to keep calm, but he felt his own heart racing. It was as if the ocean were testing them, a trial that demanded everything from each man aboard. For a moment, he looked at the map he kept in his cabin and wondered if he'd been reckless. But at the same time, an invisible force urged him onward. He knew that whatever awaited him on the island was not meant for the faint of heart, and this certainty strengthened him. The captain glanced around, seeing the terror etched on his men's faces, but he could not turn back now. With a determined expression, he commanded them to hold their positions, for there was still much to face. The ship felt as if it were in the grasp of a sea monster, tossed and thrown mercilessly. Waves crashed over the deck, and some sailors were knocked off their feet. John kept a close eye on each of them, ready to help, but he knew many were being tested for the first time. Cries of fear mingled with the storm's howling, and in the chaos, John saw something. In the depths of the dark water, he glimpsed what seemed like a massive shadow, something moving in the deep, something as ancient as the sea itself. He blinked, but the vision remained. It was an undefined silhouette, but he knew it was no figment of his imagination. Fear gripped him for a moment, but he forced himself back to reality. The Voyager held on bravely, but the battle was far from over. Lightning illuminated the waters, and with each flash, John felt as if something were watching, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Suddenly, the sea seemed to calm, as if the storm had decided to grant them a brief reprieve. The exhausted crew began to regroup, but John knew that this silence was only a pause, an interlude in a fight that was far from finished. He headed to his cabin, the map in hand, trying to decipher any clues that might guide them. He noticed markings he hadn't seen before, perhaps only visible to those willing to pay the price to face them. The captain pondered the island, now seeming closer, yet still shrouded in mystery. He knew that whatever awaited them could very well be more terrifying than the storm they had just endured. John felt the journey was only beginning and that the true test would come when they finally set foot on land. Until then, he would have to keep his determination unshaken and the trust of his men intact. Back on deck, he looked out at the horizon. The sky was slowly clearing, but the clouds still loomed heavy, as if the sea were preparing for another assault. John knew the worst was yet to come. Captain Hastings took a deep breath, and with one last look at the map, returned to his position. He was ready to move forward, no matter what awaited him in the depths. And so, he prepared for the next stage of the journey, with the sense that this was only the beginning. After the unexpected lull, the crew of the Voyager took the chance to regroup. The men were exhausted, but the sea's silence offered them a moment to breathe. John felt that danger still lurked close by. As he gazed at the horizon, he reflected on what he had seen in the midst of the storm. The shadow in the depths was no ordinary sight, and he knew this journey would become increasingly treacherous. With each passing hour, the calm seemed more like a warning than a relief. John tried to focus on the map, but he couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. It felt as if the sea was preparing for something greater, something no man could predict. The crew, though silent, shared this feeling. They exchanged looks filled with fear and uncertainty, as if sensing that something beyond nature awaited them. By evening, a dense fog began to form around the ship. It was unusual for mist to appear so quickly, yet there it was, obscuring their view and creating ghostly shapes that hovered around the Voyager. The men tried to stay on course, but they soon realized they were completely surrounded. John ordered them to slow down and stay alert, for something about the fog felt unnatural. Then came the first sign that they weren't alone. A shadow passed quickly along the ship's edge, and one of the sailors, Samuel, shouted that he'd seen something resembling a human figure in the water. John rushed to his side, but when he looked, he saw only mist. The whispers resumed, more intense this time, as if the waves were trying to share secrets that shouldn't be heard. John knew the mind could play tricks, but something about this moment made him doubt his own sanity. Suddenly, a strange noise echoed, like a distant moan from the depths of the sea. It was a deep sound that seemed to vibrate through the hull, making the ship tremble. The crew gathered on deck, looking to John for guidance. He took a deep breath and urged them to stay calm, but he felt control slipping away. It was as if the sea had become a maze with no way out, and he had no way of knowing if they were heading in the right direction. The hours that followed were a blur of shadows and sounds, until the unexpected happened. One of the sailors, Charlie, mysteriously vanished. No one could say for sure what had happened. He had been on deck one moment, and the next, he was gone as if he'd never been there. The crew, now gripped by panic, insisted that the map was cursed and that they should turn back. But John knew there was no turning back, and even if there was, he could not abandon the search. John felt the weight of responsibility. He looked at the map one last time that night and saw something he hadn't noticed before. In the lower corner, a small, strange symbol that seemed like a mix of ancient letters and a drawing of a sea creature. He knew it had to mean something, but he had no idea what. His instinct told him he was close to an answer, but the fear of losing himself to the mystery was just as strong. That night, silence fell over the ship. The men slept uneasily, plagued by nightmares, while John stayed awake, trying to decipher the riddle. He wondered if Charlie's disappearance had been a warning, a kind of punishment for defying the sea's secrets. Yet at the same time, he couldn't pull himself away from the desire to reach the island, as if something beyond his understanding was drawing him deeper. At dawn, the mist began to clear, revealing a tranquil sea, but the atmosphere remained heavy. It was as if the journey had changed. The crew, once lively, now appeared apathetic, with empty stares and expressions of suppressed dread. John knew morale was low and that he would need to find a way to keep his men focused, but he too felt that the situation was deteriorating quickly. The captain resumed his place at the helm, guiding the Voyager through the now calm waters. Yet he knew this calm was deceptive. The map continued to call to him, and he realized that, despite the dangers, he was determined to uncover what the island held. With each mile they sailed, John felt they were drawing closer to something monumental, something perhaps beyond any man's comprehension. He braced himself for whatever lay ahead, feeling that the real ordeal was just beginning. On board the Voyager, the crew barely had time to process Charlie's disappearance when they finally spotted land. A cry of relief and surprise echoed among the men as they observed the silhouette of the island emerging through the mist. The sight was both majestic and eerie. The island seemed wrapped in a shroud of mystery, with high cliffs and dense vegetation stretching as far as the eye could see. John felt a mix of relief and unease as he saw their destination ahead. As the ship approached, the captain noticed details that made him question the safety of this place. Sharp rocks surrounded the island, forming natural barriers that made approaching treacherous. He ordered the men to slow down and steer with caution. With every yard gained, silence grew, broken only by the sound of waves crashing against the stones. It was as if the island were guarded by an invisible force, something that discouraged any trespasser from stepping ashore. Once they disembarked, John and his men felt a strange change in the air. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating, and an unsettling sensation settled among them. He led the crew along a narrow trail winding through ancient trees and exposed roots, as if the ground itself were trying to ensnare them. As they moved deeper, John noticed ruins scattered along the path, remnants of structures that seemed to belong to different historical periods. It was as if the island were a graveyard of forgotten civilizations. Exploring further, they came across a stone arch covered in moss, inscribed with symbols John couldn't recognize. He tried to decipher the characters, but they were written in a language completely unfamiliar to him. With each step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, as though the island's eyes followed their every move. Some men suggested they return to the ship, but John was determined. He knew this was the key to unraveling the mystery, and he would not turn back now. A little farther on, they came upon what seemed to be an altar. In its center lay a stone etched with strange marks that resembled drawings of sea creatures and human-like forms entwined. The captain touched the cold surface of the rock, and suddenly, a memory of the shadow he had seen during the storm flashed in his mind. He wondered if what he saw was a clue or a warning. But before he could dwell on it, something caught the men's attention: footprints on the ground, fresh, as if someone had been walking there moments before. Following the tracks, they arrived at a small, abandoned settlement, with wooden huts and tools scattered on the ground. John noticed that the items were from different eras. There were medieval armor pieces, equipment from Renaissance explorers, and even artifacts from more ancient cultures, like clay pots with tribal designs. It was as if the island were a convergence point for various timelines. The idea was both fascinating and terrifying, and he knew they were standing before something that defied human understanding. As they explored, they began to see strange figures in the mist, shadows that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. One of the sailors, Henry, swore he had seen a woman dressed in old-fashioned clothing watching him from across a clearing. But when John turned to look, there was no one there. He knew the mind could play tricks, but there was something all too real about these figures that appeared and vanished without explanation. He couldn't tell if it was an illusion or a manifestation of the island itself, but he was increasingly convinced they had crossed into a place where time did not follow normal rules. John gathered his men and decided they needed to return to the ship before darkness enveloped them completely. But as they tried to head back, they realized the path was no longer the same. The trees looked different, and the sounds of the forest had changed. It was as if the island were shifting around them, making it impossible to retrace their steps. The feeling of disorientation was overwhelming, and John sensed they were being drawn deeper, toward a point of no return. As they walked, the captain felt they were close to something significant, something perhaps buried beneath the surface. He realized that while the island was shrouded in mysteries, it was more than just a forgotten piece of land. Here, time seemed to be a living entity, shaping and controlling everything around them. John didn't know what awaited them, but he was certain the journey was far from over. As they ventured deeper into the dense forest, John and his crew began to realize that the island harbored something far beyond ruins and mist. As they walked, figures began to appear among the trees. Men and women in clothing from other eras, figures seemingly frozen in time, watching them with expressions that ranged from curiosity to despair. John tried to stay calm, but he knew the others were on the brink of panic. It was as if the island were a refuge for lost souls, captured in a reality that didn't belong to them. A man in medieval armor appeared before them, his gaze fixed on a distant point. John tried to speak, but the figure simply turned and disappeared into the mist. He barely had time to process what he'd just seen when a woman, dressed in 18th century attire, emerged on his left. She seemed confused, touching a tree as if it were something extraordinary. The crew looked to John, hoping he had answers for what was happening. But he too was at a loss for words. With each step, they encountered more figures. Explorers from different ages, navigators, soldiers, all appeared lost, trapped in a time that wasn't theirs. John felt a chill as he realized some of these figures seemed aware of their presence, while others acted as though he and his men were invisible. What scared him most was the idea that, somehow, they too could become part of this strange parade of ghosts from the past. As he tried to find a way through the forest, John stumbled over something solid. Looking down, he saw it was an old sword, partially buried in the ground. He lifted it and noticed it was covered in unfamiliar runes. There was something unsettling about the object, as if it had been left there on purpose. The captain examined the sword, wondering if it had belonged to one of the men who wandered here, and what could have happened for him to leave it behind. Suddenly, a voice called his name. John turned quickly, expecting to see someone familiar, but the figure who called him was dressed as a navigator from the 16th century. The man looked dazed, his gaze empty, as if he were barely aware of where he was. John tried to ask what was happening, but the figure faded before his eyes, as if he'd never been there. The feeling that time on the island was warped intensified with every moment. John realized there was a greater presence on the island, something that seemed to manipulate time and the lives of those who approached. It was as if the island were a magnet, drawing in those who had lost their way, holding them in its web of overlapping eras. He knew they needed to find a way out before they became part of this temporal trap, but he had no idea how to do so. As they walked, Henry, one of the sailors, pointed to a statue partially covered by vegetation. Approaching it, they saw it depicted a man in modern clothing, someone they could have encountered in any city. John was intrigued, as it made no sense. How could such a recent figure be represented here, among symbols and figures from so long ago? The feeling that something was profoundly wrong was overwhelming. The group continued to explore, but soon they began to realize they were walking in circles. The trees, which had once seemed distinct, now formed a repetitive pattern, as if they were inside a labyrinth created to confuse and disorient them. John knew they needed to get out of there as soon as possible, but every attempt to find a way out led them back to where they'd started. It was as if the island were alive, playing with them, challenging them to find a path where none existed. John felt time slipping away. He knew he couldn't let his men fall into the trap that had captured so many before them. There was something on the island that fed on the despair and confusion of those who landed there. With renewed determination, he decided they needed to find a high point from where they could observe the landscape and perhaps plot an escape. Yet the island seemed always a step ahead, closing off every exit and drawing them ever closer to the heart of its unfathomable mystery. John felt the weight of every step as he and his crew ventured deeper into the island. The idea that time was distorted here became more tangible with each passing moment, and the fear that they might never leave began to creep into his mind. Yet he knew he had to keep calm and lead his men, even if every fiber of his being screamed that they had stepped into a place they were never meant to find. In the distance, he spotted a hill that seemed to offer a broader view of the island. Determined to find a way out, he led the men toward it. The path was difficult, and the vegetation seemed to close in around them, as if the island were trying to prevent them from ascending. When they finally reached the top, the sight was both terrifying and revealing. The landscape was a patchwork of eras and ruins that couldn't coexist anywhere else in the world. It was as if they had entered a dimension where time was not a line, but a tangled knot. John knew that to escape, they would need to challenge the very nature of this place. He instructed the men to look for anything that could serve as a landmark, but everything seemed to repeat chaotically. Suddenly, a deep sound echoed in the distance, similar to what they had heard at sea, and he knew their time was running out. The island seemed alive, reacting to their every move, as though an unseen presence were closely monitoring them. Suddenly, one of the sailors, Tom, pointed out an opening between some rocks below, something that looked like the entrance to a cave. John felt a strange sense of familiarity as he gazed at the spot, as though it were part of the destiny that had drawn him here. He ordered the men to follow him and quickly descended toward the cave, aware that this might be their last chance to understand what was happening and perhaps find a way out. Inside the cave, they found that the walls were covered in inscriptions and drawings that seemed to depict scenes of shipwrecks, sea creatures, and humans in despair. It was as though this place held the memories of all those who had been drawn to the island. The sense of oppression grew, and some men began to murmur that they were cursed. John tried to keep them focused, but he too felt the weight of it all, as though he stood on the edge of a precipice. At the back of the cave, they discovered a peculiar object, a circle of stones, marked with symbols that resembled a calendar from a culture unknown to him. At the center, a flickering flame, which seemed impossible to exist in that environment. John realized this was not just a cave, but a shrine, perhaps the very center of the island's power. He understood that this flame was a symbol, something that kept the cycle of entrapment going, and if they wanted to escape, they would need to break that cycle. John approached the flame, hesitant but with a determination that grew stronger by the second. He knew he had to make a decision, and every second mattered. As he touched the flame, an intense heat enveloped him, and he felt as though he were being pulled outside of himself, as if the island were absorbing his memories, his past, and his future. Everything around him disappeared, and he found himself surrounded only by shadows and echoes of voices that seemed to come from another life. Suddenly, he was snapped out of the trance by a deafening sound, as though the island were reacting to his action. The cave walls began to shake, and John knew they didn't have much time. He ordered the men to run, and together, they rushed out of the cave as the ground trembled beneath them. When they reached the outside, they saw that the entire island seemed to be convulsing, as though they were about to witness the collapse of this strange world. With his heart racing, John led the men back down the path they had come. He felt that they had disturbed something they couldn't comprehend, but he knew this was their only path to freedom. Yet the island seemed unwilling to let them go. Shadows followed them, and the very sound of the island seemed to roar, as if trying to stop them at any cost. But John knew they couldn't stop now, not after everything they had faced. The race away from the island was a battle against time itself. John felt the weight of what they had awakened, and the sense that the island was pursuing them became more real with each step. The trees seemed to move, forming barriers that made escape difficult, and shadows trailed them as though they were part of the very ground. John kept ahead, guiding his men back to the ship, ignoring the fear and doubt that tried to creep into his mind. As they caught sight of the Voyager anchored in the distance, they felt a flicker of hope. The men hurried on board, each one rushing to their station. John took the wheel and ordered the sails to be raised. But as they looked out over the waters ahead, they saw that the thick, oppressive mist still surrounded them. The island, seemingly determined to keep them, made the ocean around them look like an endless maze. John wasn't sure if they were in the same place or if the island had swallowed them whole, but he knew they couldn't give up. As the ship pressed on, John noticed that the horizon wasn't changing. It was as if they were sailing in circles, always returning to the same point. The men, tired and desperate, looked at him with silent questions. But John stayed calm and decided to chart a different course, relying on instinct and the map that, somehow, still seemed to guide them. He knew the island possessed a power beyond any of them, but he also believed that somewhere in the sea lay an exit, a path perhaps invisible to the naked eye. As they sailed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. John glanced at the map and saw that the symbols on it seemed to shift, as though they were alive. He tried to ignore this, focusing solely on holding their course. Suddenly, the sky began to clear, revealing a faint line of light in the distance. It was the first time since entering the mist that they'd seen anything other than the blank whiteness, and John knew they had to follow that direction, no matter the cost. The Voyager moved slowly, but the light on the horizon seemed to retreat each time they tried to approach it. The sense of frustration was overwhelming, and some men began to murmur about the impossibility of escaping. But John silenced them with a firm look. He knew that if they began to doubt, the island would consume them. With renewed determination, he urged the men to hold their course, even as the shadows around them seemed to close in like claws ready to grasp them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they broke through the mist. The sky was clear, and the sea, now calm, stretched out before them like a promise of freedom. The men sighed with relief, and John felt a weight lift from his shoulders. But as he looked back, he saw the island still there, shrouded in mist, as though it had never moved. It was as if time there had not passed, and he knew that somehow, that place would continue to exist, waiting for the next reckless navigators. Yet, as they sailed toward the horizon, a sense of unease took hold of John. Something felt wrong. He looked out at the sea and noticed that the compass was spinning erratically, pointing in random directions. The feeling that the island had marked them was palpable. He knew that although they had escaped, something from that journey would remain with them forever. John glanced at the map one last time and saw that it had transformed into a blank parchment, as if the island itself had erased it from memory. Days passed, and though they sailed in calm waters, the Voyager seemed unable to find its way home. John wondered if they had truly escaped or if they were trapped in a cycle that would never end. The men, who had once been filled with hope, now appeared apathetic, as if the island had taken a piece of each of them. But John knew that as long as they held on to faith, they could find a new direction, a new starting point. The sea stretched out before them, a vast emptiness that offered both freedom and the unknown. John kept his grip on the wheel, aware that time, like the ocean, was a force that no one could fully master. And as the Voyager sailed on its uncertain course, he knew that the mystery of the island would continue to haunt them, a shadow that would never fully fade.